Come on, if Patricia's right, you left a trail. Wells' price? Come on. No. Jordan, this is Cameron. She's family. I introduced you. I gave you both each other. You planned this. $15,000, $47,000. My savings. Did you find something? I found the property. Jordan? He's married. To who? Cameron. Cameron Wells. How long can you talk? As long as it takes. Then let's start building the case.
Morgan Hayes found out about the marriage the same way she found out about the money. Not through a conversation, not through a confrontation, through a public record. She had been searching the Fulton County property database for weeks, methodically, because her attorney had told her that if Jordan Price had used her investment funds to purchase real estate, there would be a record of it somewhere that his name was attached to. She was at her desk on a Tuesday afternoon in her apartment in Decatur, coffee going cold beside her keyboard, when she found the property. A single-family home in the East Point neighborhood of Atlanta, purchased 11 months prior. The buyer of record, Jordan T. Price and Cameron A. Wells Price. She read the name once, then again. Wells Price. She went to the Fulton County marriage records. It took 4 minutes to find it. Jordan Theodore Price and Cameron Antoinette Wells, married 11 months ago in a civil ceremony. She sat at her desk for a long time. She had introduced Jordan to Cameron. She had brought him into the circle of people she trusted most in the world. She had handed him access to the person who was, outside of her mother, the most important relationship in her adult life. And he had used that access, and Cameron had let him use it, and the two of them had built something together on the foundation of what they had taken from her. Morgan Hayes sat at her desk on a Tuesday afternoon, and she understood, in the specific, complete way of a person receiving a truth that makes every prior confusion retroactively clear, the full shape of what had been done to her. Then she picked up the phone, and she called Patricia Lawson. She said, "I found the property, and I found something else." Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long can you talk?" Morgan said, "As long as it takes." That was the beginning of the end of what Jordan Price and Cameron Wells Price had built together on Morgan Hayes' money. Jordan Price purchased the East Point property for $218,000. Of that purchase price, $47,000 came from Morgan Hayes' savings account, transferred to Jordan's investment account in 3 installments over 8 months. Morgan was not on the deed. Cameron Wells Price was. By the end of this story, you will understand every single layer of what was built around Morgan Hayes. Who built it, when it was built, and at what cost, to a woman who had spent 8 years accumulating $47,000 one careful decision at a time. You will understand what Jordan Price told her about the investment, what he did not tell her, and what Cameron Wells knew and chose not to say during 18 months when they were both present in Morgan's life in ways designed never to intersect. You will understand what a property record found on a Tuesday afternoon produced in a Fulton County courtroom. And you will understand what Cameron Wells sent Morgan in a text message. Not an apology, not an acknowledgement, but a request, 8 months after the judgment was entered. And you will understand exactly what Morgan did with that text. 3 things need to be understood before this story can tell you what it actually is. The first, Morgan Hayes was not careless. She was not someone who trusted easily or without reason. She was a 34-year-old freelance graphic designer who had spent her entire adult life operating with the specific financial discipline of a woman who had watched her mother work a physically demanding job for 26 years to keep the lights on, and had understood, from that watching, that the margin between stability and its absence is thinner than people who have not lived close to it believe. She had $47,000 in savings because she had made $47,000 worth of deliberate choices, choosing the smaller apartment, skipping the vacation, driving the paid-off car, turning down the client who paid slowly, and taking the one who paid on time. She was not the kind of person who handed $47,000 to someone on instinct. She handed it to Jordan Price because two people she trusted gave her reasons to trust him, and both of those people had reasons of their own for giving her those reasons. The second, Cameron Wells is not a minor character in this story. She is not the unnamed other woman or the faceless co-conspirator. She was Morgan's best friend for 12 years. 12 years of weekly dinners at a rotation of restaurants in Decatur and East Atlanta. They had been working through together since 2013. 12 years of being the first person Morgan called when she needed to think something through. 12 years of being the person Morgan called about Jordan Price specifically to ask what she thought, and Cameron said, "He seems solid, Morgan." She said, "I trust your judgment." She said these things from a position of already knowing Jordan Price in a way she had not disclosed, and from a position of already investing with Jordan Price in a way she had not disclosed, and from a position of feelings for Jordan Price that she had not disclosed. She said, "I trust your judgment," while she was one of the reasons Morgan's judgment was incomplete. That is not a minor character. That is the center of the story. Everything else, the money, the property, the courtroom, everything else builds from that. The third, the justice in this story does not arrive early. It does not arrive in the middle. What arrives in the first portion of this story is the investment and the friendship and the 18 months during which both of those things operated the way they were designed to operate, producing in Morgan Hayes a sustained, specific trust in two people who were simultaneously in contact with each other in ways Morgan did not know about. The justice arrives in the final third, and it arrives through a public record and a civil judgment and a text message and 2 sentences. Understanding why those 2 sentences matter, understanding what they cost Morgan to write, and what they revealed about who Cameron believed Morgan still was after everything that had happened, requires you to understand the 18 months that came before them. So start from the beginning. Start from Decatur. Start from Renee Hayes and a partition wall and a specific instruction about money that Morgan heard when she was young enough for it to become structural rather than decorative. That is where the story actually begins. Before we go any further into this incredible story, do me a favor. If you love stories about justice, betrayal, revenge, and unexpected plot twists, hit that subscribe button right now. Seriously, you do not want to miss what comes next on this channel. Drop a like on this video, it helps more than you think, and comment below where you are watching from so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Morgan Hayes grew up in Decatur, Georgia, in a 1-bedroom apartment that became a 2-bedroom when her mother, Renee Hayes, converted the living room with a partition wall that took an entire Saturday to install, and that Renee had done herself because she could not afford to hire anyone to do it. Renee was a postal carrier. She walked a delivery route in Decatur for 26 years in the Georgia heat and the Georgia rain and the specific weight of a job that asks the same thing of you every single day and gives you no credit for the days when the weight is heavier than others. She raised Morgan alone, with the specific efficiency of a single mother who does not have the time or the energy to repeat herself on the things that matter most. The most important thing she said to Morgan, across Morgan's childhood, was not a speech. It was a recurring statement, delivered in the flat, factual tone of someone stating an operating principle rather than offering advice. The only person you can absolutely count on to protect your money is yourself. Other people will have reasons for what they do with it. You are the only one whose reasons are the same as yours. Morgan was a serious student in the specific way of children who have watched their parent work hard and understand, without being told directly, that the degree of effort required to keep the lights on is not a level of effort they want to sustain for the rest of their lives, and that the way out of that level of effort is performance in school. She excelled. She graduated from Georgia State University in 2012 with a graphic design degree and a partial scholarship that had made the program financially possible. She had worked part-time throughout at a print shop in Decatur that turned out to be an unexpectedly excellent training ground for someone going into graphic design professionally, because a print shop is where you learn what design looks like when it has to survive contact with physical production rather than existing only as a file on a screen. She went freelance immediately after graduation, building a client base with the same organized persistence she brought to everything. She was not overnight successful. She was consistently improving, consistently employed, consistently delivering work that produced referrals, which is the only sustainable foundation a freelance career has. By 26, she had built something that could support her. By 30, she had built something she was genuinely proud of. And from the first invoice she cashed at 22, she had been saving. 10% of everything in the early years, when 10% was all that was available after rent and expenses. 15% when she could manage 15. 20% in the years when the client work was good and the living costs were still disciplined enough to make 20% possible. She did not save with a specific target in mind, or not initially. She saved because Renee Hayes had told her to, and because the watching she had done across her childhood had made the instructions structural rather than optional, and because saving felt like the only form of genuine security available to her. By 34, she had $47,000 in a high-yield savings account at a credit union in Decatur that she had been a member of since she was 19. She was not wealthy. She was prepared. She was the specific kind of prepared that costs the most to lose, because it was built through years of small choices rather than through a single windfall, and because losing it meant not just the money but the years behind it. Morgan met Tanya Wells at a professional networking event in Atlanta in 2010, when Morgan was 22 and Cameron was 21, and both of them were new enough to the professional world to have attended a networking event with genuine intentions and experienced enough to recognize, within 30 minutes of arrival, that this particular networking event had been organized by people who had never attended one and did not understand what made them useful. They left together after 45 minutes, walked to a restaurant 2 blocks away, and had the kind of 2-hour conversation that announces a friendship before you have had the time to name it as one. They discovered they lived 6 blocks apart in Decatur. They discovered they had graduated from Georgia schools within a year of each other and had the same specific opinions about a surprising number of things, delivered in the same specific rhythm of people who think at a similar speed and find it enjoyable to be in conversation with someone who can keep up. They exchanged numbers before the check arrived. Cameron texted Morgan before Morgan had reached her car. The friendship had been going since that evening for 12 years. 12 years is a long time to know someone, and the length of it is not automatically the same as the depth of it. But in the case of Morgan and Cameron, the length and the depth were both real. They had weekly dinners for most of those years, a rotation of restaurants in Decatur and East Atlanta that they maintained with the specific commitment of 2 people who understand that friendships require scheduling rather than convenience. That the people you love most are exactly the people you have to deliberately prioritize rather than the ones you drift toward when nothing else is happening. They had seen each other through things, job losses, on both sides. A death in Morgan's family that happened in the 2nd year of the friendship, and during which Cameron showed up in the specific, unrehearsed way that reveals who someone actually is in a crisis. Not with performance, but with presence. With food, with the ability to sit in a room with grief, without needing to fix it. Relationships that ended badly. Celebrations that mattered. The full, ordinary, extraordinary texture of a decade plus of adult friendship in which 2 people are each other's primary sounding board and the person they call first when they need to think something through. Cameron's mother, Tanya Wells, called Morgan her bonus daughter. This was not a figure of speech. Tanya Wells was a retired schoolteacher from Stone Mountain who had known Morgan since Morgan and Cameron were 22, and who had, across 12 years, grown to regard Morgan with the uncomplicated warmth of a parent who has looked at her child's choices and found this particular one worth approving of fully and without reservation. Morgan called her Miss Tanya, the way she had called her Miss Tanya since 2010, in the slightly formal but genuine address that Black American women of a certain age are called by the younger women they have folded into their care. Miss Tanya made sure Morgan had food at her table when Morgan came for Sunday dinners. Miss Tanya called Morgan on her birthday every year without being reminded. Miss Tanya was, for 12 years, a piece of the extended family that Morgan had built around herself in adulthood in the specific way that people who are raised by single parents sometimes build it. Not from blood, but from duration and deliberate inclusion. She was sitting in her living room in Stone Mountain in January of 2024 when Morgan drove up and knocked on her door and sat across from her and told her what her daughter had done. Morgan met Jordan Price in March of 2021 at a dinner gathering at a mutual friend's home in Stone Mountain. He was 35. He was a commercial real estate investor and property manager with his own small operation. Not large, but credible, With a portfolio of several rental properties in Atlanta neighborhoods, he could describe with the precision of someone who has been paying attention to a market for years. He was well-dressed without announcing it. He had the ease of a man who is comfortable in social settings because he has been deliberate about developing that comfort rather than because ease is his natural condition. He was handsome in a way that he carried without leaning on it. He made people feel attended to, which is a skill rather than a personality trait, though the distinction requires you to have observed it carefully over time before you understand it as such. He got Morgan's number before the dinner ended. He called 2 days later, at a reasonable hour, which she noted. He asked if she was free on Friday. She said Saturday. He said Saturday was perfect. He picked her up at 7. The relationship that developed across the spring and summer of 2021 was, from Morgan's experience of it, exactly what a healthy developing relationship between two compatible adults looks like. He was consistent. He showed up when he said he would. He was attentive in the specific way that requires memory rather than performance. He remembered what she had said in prior conversations and referenced those things correctly, not to demonstrate that he had been listening, but in the natural way of someone who actually had been. He met Renee Hayes on a Sunday in June and was warm to her in the specific way that requires a man to understand what matters to a woman who was raised by a single mother, which is that the mother is the most important person in the story and should be treated as such. Renee made coffee. Jordan drank it. He asked Renee about her work and listened to the answer. He stayed for 2 hours and left when it was natural to leave and thanked Renee sincerely on the way out. On the drive home, Morgan called Cameron and said, "I think this might actually be something." Cameron said, "That is what I have been waiting to hear you say." She said it warmly, with the specific warmth that 12 years of friendship produces, the warmth of someone who has been through the relationships that did not work and is genuinely glad to hear a note in their person's voice that suggests this one is different. She asked questions. She listened to the answers. She said, "He sounds like someone who is actually paying attention." She was right that he was paying attention. The nature of the attention, what it was directed at, what it was building toward, was what she had not disclosed. Because Cameron Wells had met Jordan Price in November of 2020, 4 months before he met Morgan at the Stone Mountain dinner. She had met him through a mutual professional contact in Atlanta. They had spent time together in the months before the dinner. She had feelings for him. And when a mutual friends gathering in March of 2021 created the occasion for Jordan and Morgan to meet, Cameron had been present, had arranged in the specific, invisible way of someone who has thought about what they want a situation to produce, for the introduction to happen. She did not introduce them as people with existing knowledge of each other. She introduced them as strangers. She watched. She said, "He sounds like someone who is actually paying attention." He was. So was she. By September of 2021, 3 months into Morgan and Jordan's relationship, Morgan brought Jordan to one of the weekly dinners she and Cameron had been having for years, a restaurant in East Atlanta that both women loved, on a Thursday evening. She introduced them. What Morgan experienced in that introduction was the warmth of a best friend who is meeting someone important for the first time and responding with the genuine enthusiasm of someone who is happy for the person she loves. What she was not experiencing, what she had no way of experiencing, because the information required to experience it had been withheld from her, was the specific quality of two people meeting in a social setting while pretending to meet for the first time. They shook hands. They made the kind of conversation that strangers make at a dinner when they have a mutual friend. They asked each other questions. Jordan was warm to Cameron in the way he was warm to everyone Morgan introduced him to. Cameron was warm to Jordan in the way Morgan understood as friendship warmth. The restaurant was good. The evening was easy. On the drive home, Morgan called Cameron from the car and asked what she thought. Cameron said, "He is really good, Morgan." She said, "He asks the right questions." She said, "I am happy for you." 3 people at a dinner table. One of them did not know what the other 2 knew. She was the one paying for the meal. The investment came up in January of 2022, 4 months into Morgan and Jordan's relationship. They were at her apartment in Decatur on a Sunday evening, and Jordan was describing a property opportunity he had been evaluating, a single-family home in the East Point neighborhood of Atlanta that he believed was in a pocket of the market that was appreciating faster than the broader Atlanta residential data suggested, that could be purchased, renovated, and held as a rental or sold within 18 months at a return that the comparable sales supported. He was not, in January, asking Morgan for anything. He was thinking out loud about a professional decision in the way of someone who is comfortable enough with the person he is with to let them hear the working of his mind on a business question. Morgan asked questions. She had always been someone who asked questions. It was the professional instinct of someone whose work required her to understand what a client's situation actually was before she could design anything useful for it. Jordan answered all of them. He had the numbers. He had the comparable sales in the area. He had the renovation cost estimates from a contractor he had used before. He had the projected return under 3 different scenarios: conservative, likely, and optimistic. It was, by every visible measure, the prepared presentation of a person who was professionally credible in a domain where Morgan was not. She did not make any commitment in January. She said the property sounded interesting, and she asked if she could look at some of the comparable sales he had referenced. He sent them. She looked at them. She was not a real estate professional, but she was a professional who understood how to read data presented to support a position, and the data he sent was consistent with the picture he had described. She filed it. She did not bring it up again. He mentioned in late January that he was still evaluating the financing on the deal because his available capital was committed to other properties he was managing. She noted that. 6 weeks later, in February, she raised it herself. She asked how the East Point deal was looking. He said it had become more attractive. A competing offer had fallen through, and the seller was now more motivated, which had created a potential to negotiate the price, but that the financing gap remained and that the timeline for closing was becoming tighter than he would like. She asked what the gap was. He told her. She asked what a co-investment would look like. He told her that too. He told her the projected return on a co-investment of $40,000 to $50,000 was 15 to 20% over 18 months. He told her to think about it. She called Cameron that evening. The phone call to Cameron was 4 minutes long. Morgan described the opportunity. She described Jordan's numbers. She described the comparable sales she had reviewed. She said, "I have done my own research, and the market data is consistent with what he is saying." She said, "I am thinking about investing some of my savings." She asked, "What do you think?" Cameron was quiet for 3 seconds. She said, "How much are you thinking?" Morgan said, "About $47,000. Cameron asked, "Are you sure about this?" Morgan said, "I think so. I have seen his other properties. He has a track record." Cameron said, "Okay." Morgan said, "But what do you think?" Cameron said, "If you are sure, Morgan, then I think you should do what makes sense to you." She said, "He seems solid." She said, "I trust your judgment." She said these things. She said them from a position of already having had the investment conversation with Jordan herself, from a position of already having decided to co-invest, from a position of knowing the structure of the deal in a way that Morgan did not know she knew it. She said, "I trust your judgment," while she was one of the reasons Morgan's judgment was missing a critical piece of information. She said, "Okay." And Morgan called Jordan that evening and told him she was in. The first installment was $15,000, transferred in February of 2022 from Morgan's credit union savings account to a business account in Jordan Price's name. It was the largest single outgoing transfer Morgan had ever made in her adult life, and she sat with it before she initiated it in the way that she sat with any significant financial decision, reviewing the information available to her, checking the account details, considering the decision one final time. She made the transfer. She told herself, "This is what it feels like to make a real investment rather than just saving." She had spent 12 years accumulating, and she was now doing something with what she had accumulated, and that felt like a maturation of her relationship with her own money, rather than a risk to it. The second installment was $17,000 in April. Jordan had provided an update by then. Photographs of the property showing the early stages of renovation work, a brief summary of the contractor's progress, a note that the timeline was on track. The third installment was $15,000 in June. 3 installments, 8 months, $47,000. Every cent of it was in Jordan Price's account. None of it was in any agreement that had been signed by both of them. None of it was in any legal document that established Morgan's interest in the property it had been used to purchase. She had asked about the documentation. She had asked twice in the period of the 3 installments, and twice more across the following months, in the measured, patient way of someone who understands that business processes have timelines and who does not want to appear anxious or distrustful in a relationship where trust was both the personal and the professional foundation. Jordan's responses were always reasonable and always incomplete. He said the partnership documentation was being prepared by his attorney and would be sent when finalized. He sent something in September that looked like a formal investment agreement, a document with headers and numbered clauses and both their names at the top. She read it. It appeared thorough. She asked if she needed to have her own attorney review it before she signed. He said that was entirely her call, that most of his investors signed the standard form, but that he had no objection to her getting a second review. She said she would get it reviewed. She sent it to a friend who was in law school at the time and who looked at it briefly and said it seemed fine to her. Standard language, nothing unusual. Morgan signed it. She did not learn until much later, when Patricia Lawson reviewed the same document, that it was a template pulled from an internet resource that had never been properly executed, that the notarization on it was invalid, and that it would have no legal standing in any proceeding where its validity was tested. What was actually happening in the period between February and September of 2022, while Morgan was making her 3 installments and asking about documentation and receiving updates and telling herself she was being patient and professional about a real investment, is the part of this story that requires you to hold 2 timelines in your mind simultaneously. In Morgan's timeline, she was investing in a real estate opportunity presented by her boyfriend and endorsed, silently but clearly, by her best friend. In the parallel timeline, the one that Morgan could not see because both of the people running it had agreed, through their ongoing contact with each other, to make sure she could not see it, Jordan Price and Tanya Wells were in an active relationship. They had been in contact for 18 months before the East Point property was purchased. Cameron had also contributed funds to the deal. The property that was purchased with Morgan's $47,000 as a significant portion of the down payment was purchased in both Jordan's and Cameron's names. Not in Jordan's name alone, as Morgan understood the investment structure to be, and certainly not in Morgan's name, as she had believed her investment would eventually produce. The marriage had happened in August of 2022, 1 month before the property closed in September. It had been a civil ceremony, quiet, without announcements, without the kind of social visibility that might produce a post or a photograph that could travel to someone in Decatur who knew both parties. Jordan Price and Tanya Wells had married in August of 2022 without telling anyone in Morgan's world, and had purchased a property together in September of 2022 with a down payment that included $47,000 from Morgan's savings account, and had done both of these things while Jordan was still in a relationship with Morgan and Cameron was still attending the occasional dinner with Morgan, and both of them were still receiving Morgan's trust, on which the entire arrangement depended for its continuation. The property was titled Wells Price. The certificate of marriage was filed in Fulton County. Both were public records, available to anyone who looked. Nobody in Morgan's life looked. Nobody in Morgan's life had a reason to look. There was no visible inconsistency in what Morgan could see that would have prompted a search. The system was working. The distance. Fall 2022. Something changed in the fall of 2022. Morgan would identify it later, looking backward from the Tuesday of the property record discovery, as the period immediately following the property purchase and the marriage, the period when the critical construction phase was complete, and the sustained, specific attention that Jordan had deployed to keep Morgan patient and trusting became less operationally necessary because the thing it had been deployed to protect was already done. He was still present. He was still providing investment updates. He was still warm in the functional ways of a person who has not yet ended a relationship and has reasons for not ending it immediately. But the quality of his presence changed, not dramatically, not in a way that produced a visible rupture, but in the specific way that a person's presence changes when their primary attention is located somewhere other than where it appears to be. Morgan noticed this in the peripheral vision of her intuition before she had language for it. She filed it as, "Things are different in some way I cannot name." She told herself she was imagining it. She had $47,000 in his investment and 12 years of friendship invested in her best friend's opinion of him. Both of those facts argued strongly for the interpretation that she was imagining it. She accepted that interpretation and waited. Cameron's distance began in the same period. The weekly dinners became bi-weekly in November. By December, they were monthly. By the following spring, they were occasional. Each cancellation or postponement arriving with a specific, plausible reason. Work had been intense lately. She was dealing with a family matter. She had a prior commitment she had forgotten about when they had made plans. Morgan had the specific experience of the weekly dinners disappearing, which she experienced as the particular kind of grief that accompanies a friendship drifting. Not a rupture, not a confrontation, not an explanation, just a gradual reduction in availability that each has its own small reason, and that collectively add up to a pattern that hurts more than any individual occasion. She texted Cameron about it once. She said, "Hey, I feel like I have barely seen you lately." Cameron responded, "I know. I am so sorry. Things have just been a lot." She said, "I miss you." She said, "Let's plan something for next month." They did not plan something for next month. Morgan waited. She told herself this was what happened in long friendships when life got busy, that the connection was strong enough to survive periods of reduced contact, that Cameron would come back around when things settled down. She was right that the connection was strong. She was wrong about why Cameron was absent. Aunt Diana's warning. Morgan's Aunt Diana, her mother Renee's younger sister, 58 years old, a retired administrative assistant from DeKalb County, who had spent 30 years in professional settings watching people, and had developed, across those 30 years, a finely calibrated ear for the specific quality of someone who was very good at the presentation of confidence, without the substance it was presenting as. Aunt Diana had noticed something about Jordan Price at Renee Hayes' birthday dinner in the summer of 2022. She did not say it in the moment. She waited until the dinner was over and the guests were thinning and she and Morgan were briefly alone near the kitchen doorway, and she said, "That man is very smooth when he talks about money." She said it mildly, in the tone of an observation rather than an accusation. Morgan said, "He is good at his job." Aunt Diana said, "I know." She looked at Morgan for a moment longer than the statement required. Then she said goodnight. She raised it again in September of 2022, more directly. She and Morgan were having lunch at a restaurant in Decatur, just the two of them. And Aunt Diana said, "I have been thinking about what you said about Jordan's investment." Morgan said, "The one I am in?" Diana said, "Yes." She said, "Has he given you anything in writing that a lawyer has reviewed?" Morgan said, "He sent me an agreement that a friend looked over." Diana said, "A friend or an attorney?" Morgan said, "A friend who is in law school." Diana was quiet for a moment. She said, "Morgan, I have seen this before. Not with real estate specifically, but in offices. A person who has all the language and all the numbers and all the right answers, who makes you feel like you are the one who does not understand because they understand it so well." She said, "I am not saying he is doing anything wrong. I am saying pay attention." Morgan told Aunt Diana she appreciated it. She told her the agreement was signed and the investment was progressing. She did not tell Aunt Diana the amount she had transferred because she had told almost no one the amount, because Jordan had told her early on that keeping investment arrangements private was standard professional practice, and she had accepted this as reasonable. She drove home from lunch. She did not call Patricia Lawson. That was September of 2022. She would call Patricia Lawson in June of 2023, 9 months later. 9 months in which the East Point property was purchased, the marriage certificate was filed, and the system continued operating exactly as it had been designed to operate. 18 months of updates without documentation. The specific texture of the 18 months between Morgan's first transfer and her decision to hire Patricia Lawson in June of 2023 is important to understand in full, because it is the texture of a deception that works not through dramatic lies, but through the management of expectation and the production of plausible delay. Jordan Price was not telling Morgan nothing during this period. He was telling her things: updates, photographs, explanations, projections. The renovation at the East Point property was producing visible progress, which he documented in photographs he sent periodically. The market in the East Point area was appreciating, which the Atlanta Real Estate News confirmed independently. The partnership documentation was being prepared, was in review, was nearly finalized, was slightly delayed by a change in his attorney's workload. The formal investment agreement was coming. There was always a specific, reasonable explanation for why it had not yet arrived, and there was always a projection of when it would. It never did. And the specific structure of 18 months of this, not obvious lies but sustained, reasonable-sounding delay, is one of the hardest things to recognize from inside it as the deception it is. Because each individual explanation is believable, and the pattern only becomes visible once you have stepped back far enough from it to see the shape of it as a whole. There was one moment in the 18 months that Morgan has described as the moment she understood, at some level she was not ready to fully acknowledge, that something was not right. It was in April of 2023, 14 months after her first transfer. She asked Jordan for a specific piece of documentation, not the partnership agreement, which she had stopped pressing for, in the way that people stop pressing for things that have been delayed long enough that pressing feels useless, but a simple account statement showing the funds as a line item. She said, "I just want to see that my money is tracked somewhere as a specific entry." He said, "Absolutely, I will get that to you this week." The week passed. She asked again. He said, "My accountant is pulling the records together." 2 more weeks passed. She asked a third time. He said, "I apologize. There have been some timing issues with the quarterly reconciliation." He said he would have it to her by the end of the month. The end of the month passed. She had been through this pattern enough times that she recognized it fully in that moment, not as a single delay, but as the extended, managed pattern of someone who did not intend to produce what she was asking for. She called Renee that evening. She said, "Mom, I think something might be wrong." Renee said, "What do you mean wrong?" Morgan said, "With Jordan's investment." She said, "I think I need to talk to a real attorney." Renee said, "Then do it. Call today if you can." She called Patricia Lawson in June of 2023 on the recommendation of a colleague who had been through a contract dispute 2 years earlier and who said simply, "If someone owes you money and they are being strategic about documentation, call Patricia Lawson." Patricia took the call on a Friday afternoon. She asked Morgan to come in the following week. Morgan brought everything she had: the 3 transfer records from her credit union, the timeline of Jordan's updates, the agreement document that her law school friend had reviewed and called standard, the photographs Jordan had sent across the 18 months, a log of every request for documentation she had made, and the response she had received. Patricia reviewed all of it in a 2-hour meeting and told Morgan 3 things. First, the claim was viable, because the transfers were documented and the absence of any formal recorded agreement created a strong case for unjust enrichment. Second, the evidence was thin as presented, which meant the case required building additional documentation through the formal discovery process. Third, the most likely place to find the evidence needed to build the case was in the public real estate records for any property Jordan had purchased during the period of Morgan's transfers. She gave Morgan specific guidance on what to look for and where. She said, "Start with Fulton County. Search his name in the property database. If he used your money to buy real estate, it is in there somewhere." Morgan went home and she started searching. 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon, she found it. The 6 weeks of searching that preceded the Tuesday were evenings at her desk after her client work was finished. Methodical, using the Fulton County property search portal that Patricia had shown her how to navigate and that was publicly accessible to anyone who wanted to use it. She searched Jordan's name. She searched variations of his name. She searched business entity names that Patricia had found associated with him through a preliminary background check. She found 3 properties already in Jordan's name that predated their relationship, which were consistent with what he had told her about his existing portfolio and which were therefore not what she was looking for. She was looking for a property purchased in 2022 or 2023, during or after the period of her transfers. She did not find it for 5 weeks. On the 41st day of searching, she searched a variation of his name she had not tried before, including his middle initial, and the East Point property appeared. She clicked on it. She read the address. She read the purchase date. She read the buyer names: Jordan T. Price, Cameron A. Wells Price. She sat still at her desk. She said the name Wells Price to herself once, quietly, to confirm she was reading it correctly. She was reading it correctly. She went to the Fulton County Marriage Records portal. She typed Jordan Price. She typed Cameron Wells. She found the certificate in 4 minutes. Jordan Theodore Price and Cameron Antoinette Wells. A civil ceremony. Married 11 months before the Tuesday, she was sitting at her desk in Decatur, with her coffee going cold beside her keyboard. She looked at the certificate for a long time. She looked at the date. She looked at the names. She thought about the September dinner, the restaurant in East Atlanta, the introduction she had arranged, the conversation between 3 people, where 2 of them already knew each other, and 1 of them did not know that they did. She thought about Cameron's voice on the phone in February of 2022, saying, He seems solid, Morgan. I trust your judgment. She thought about what Cameron had known in February of 2022, that she had not shared with Morgan when she said those words. She thought about 12 years of weekly dinners and every significant phone call, and the specific warmth of Tanya Wells calling her bonus daughter. She thought about all of this for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and she called Patricia Lawson. She said, I found the property and I found something else. Patricia was quiet. Then she said, how long can you talk? She talked for 45 minutes. She described what she had found in the order she had found it. The property first, the marriage certificate second. She described the timeline that the certificate established. The marriage had predated the property purchase by 1 month, which meant both the legal union and the real estate acquisition had occurred within the period of Morgan's investment. She described the implication of Cameron's name on the deed, that the $47,000 Morgan had transferred to Jordan Price had been used, in part, to purchase a property that was titled in the name of Morgan's best friend of 12 years, without Morgan's knowledge, without Morgan's interest being recorded, and without either Jordan or Cameron having disclosed to Morgan at any point during the preceding 18 months that they were in a relationship, that they had married, or that Cameron was a co-investor in the same deal Morgan believed was being built for her benefit. Patricia listened to all of this. When Morgan finished, Patricia said, okay. She said, this changes the case significantly. She said, I need you to come in Monday morning. She said, and I need you to not contact either of them before we meet. Morgan said, I was not going to. She said it in the flat, controlled tone of someone who has felt something enormous and has decided that the enormity of it is going to be managed, not expressed, because she has learned, somewhere across the 34 years of her life, that the feelings can come later and the work has to come first. Patricia Lawson spent the 3 months between August and October of 2023 building the evidentiary foundation of Morgan Hayes' civil claim against Jordan Price. The foundation was stronger than it might have appeared in the initial 2-hour meeting where Morgan brought in her thin collection of documents, because Patricia understood, from 18 years of financial fraud litigation, that thin initial documentation in a case like this one almost always gives way to stronger evidence once the formal discovery process is initiated. The bank records from Morgan's credit union showed 3 transfers to Jordan Price's business account, with dates and amounts that were specific and unambiguous. The discovery process, once the formal case was filed, produced the corresponding bank records from Jordan's side, showing those same funds arriving, commingled with additional deposits, and then used in the East Point property closing. The additional deposits were traced to an account held by Tanya Wells, which established her as a co-investor in the transaction that had been presented to Morgan as a bilateral deal between Morgan and Jordan alone. The property deed was a public record. The marriage certificate was a public record. The evidence was there. It had always been there. It was waiting in the same public database where Patricia had told Morgan to look for it. The background search Patricia ran on Jordan Price, in the course of building the case, produced something she had not specifically anticipated, but that strengthened the claim significantly: a prior judgment. In 2020, a woman named Vivienne had filed a claim in DeKalb County Small Claims Court against Jordan Price for $22,000 she had transferred to him in 2019, framed as a bridge loan while a property deal was closing that had never been repaid. The judgment had been entered in Vivienne's favor. Jordan had never satisfied it. Patricia found it through a routine search of his name in the DeKalb County court records. She called Vivienne. Vivienne picked up on the second ring. She said, I have been waiting for someone to call me about him for 3 years. She agreed to provide a sworn affidavit describing the circumstances of the 2019 transfer, the representations Jordan had made about the investment, and the subsequent failure to repay. The affidavit was entered into the case record as Exhibit H. It established something that the East Point transaction alone could not establish, that this was not an isolated business dispute or a deal that had gone wrong. It was a pattern. The case was filed in Fulton County Superior Court in October of 2023, naming Jordan Price as the primary respondent and Tanya Wells Price as a co-respondent. The claim was for $47,000 in fraudulent investment procurement, breach of fiduciary duty, and unjust enrichment. Tanya Wells Price retained an attorney within 48 hours of the filing and filed an initial response arguing that she had invested in the East Point property as a bona fide co-purchaser. that she had no knowledge of the disputed nature of Jordan's contribution to the down payment, and that she should be treated as a separate party from Jordan. Patricia's response to this argument was a filing that documented, through the discovery process, the timeline of contact between Jordan and Cameron. A timeline established through cell phone records that showed 23 months of regular communication between them prior to the property purchase, encompassing the full period of Morgan's investment. It established that Cameron and Jordan had been in ongoing contact during the same months that Cameron was telling Morgan she trusted her judgment. Jordan's deposition would eventually be the moment the case acquired its clearest single piece of evidence. Jordan Price appeared at his deposition in March of 2024, composed and professionally prepared, accompanied by his attorney. He had the specific quality of someone who had been in professional settings his whole career, and who understood that the appearance of calm was itself a form of argument. He answered the early portions of the deposition, his professional history, the nature of his real estate business, his prior investment arrangements, with the fluency of someone who has organized a coherent account and is delivering it competently. Patricia let him speak. She asked clarifying questions at specific points. She built, across the first hour of the deposition, a detailed map of the specific account he was prepared to give. Then, at the point in the deposition where the timeline of his relationship with Tanya Wells came up, she asked him when the romantic relationship with Cameron had begun. He said, after the property purchase. He said it with the same composed precision he had brought to the whole proceeding. Patricia opened the folder in front of her and placed a document on the table. The document was a summary of the cell phone records obtained in discovery, specific dates, specific contacts, organized chronologically. The contacts began 23 months before the property purchase. They included the months when Jordan was beginning his relationship with Morgan. She asked him to review the records and indicate whether the dates shown were accurate to his knowledge. He looked at his attorney. His attorney said, "Take your time." He took his time. Then he gave an answer that his attorney described in a subsequent filing as imprecise, and that Patricia described, in her response, as contrary to the documentary evidence. The deposition transcript was entered into the record. It was not favorable to Jordan Price. The Fulton County Superior Court entered its judgment in May of 2024, 14 months after Morgan had sat at her desk in Decatur on a Tuesday afternoon and found a property record with a name on it she had not expected. The court found that the transfer of $47,000 from Morgan Hayes' account to Jordan Price's account, combined with the absence of any executed legal agreement establishing the nature of that transfer, and combined with the subsequent use of those funds as a portion of the down payment on a property titled exclusively in the names of Jordan Price and Tanya Wells Price without Morgan's knowledge or recorded interest, constituted unjust enrichment. The court found that the pattern of conduct documented across multiple complainants, including the Vivienne Cole affidavit, was relevant to the question of intent, and established that the failure to repay was not a matter of business difficulty, but of design. The court ordered Jordan Price to repay Morgan Hayes $47,000, plus interest calculated from the date of the first transfer, plus a portion of her legal fees. Jordan's attorney filed an appeal within the statutory deadline. The appeal was heard and denied. The East Point property, now subject to a lien from the judgment, was sold to satisfy Morgan's award. Jordan Price and Tanya Wells Price lost the property that had been built on Morgan's money. The East Point property sold for $206,000, producing proceeds that, after the mortgage payoff, went to Morgan Hayes as partial satisfaction of the judgment. The remainder of the award was to be collected from Jordan's other assets, which were identified in the discovery process and against which liens had been placed during the proceedings. Jordan's appeal had failed. His other real estate holdings were encumbered. His professional network in Atlanta, the specific, relationship-dependent world of commercial real estate investment in a mid-sized city where your name travels with your reputation, had received, through the public record of the Fulton County proceedings, an accurate account of what his name was now attached to. Several of his professional relationships ended without public explanation in the months following the judgment. He has not maintained a visible professional presence in Atlanta since. He left the city without announcement. Whether he replicated the pattern elsewhere, the same patience, the same attentiveness, the same investment framing presented to a woman who trusted him, is not publicly known. Vivienne Cole monitors his name in public records periodically. She has not found anything yet. She is still watching. Vivienne Cole, who provided the affidavit that became Exhibit H in Morgan's case, received a portion of the judgment proceeds once Morgan's full recovery had been satisfied, an inclusion that Patricia had argued for and the court had agreed to as appropriate given Vivienne's prior unsatisfied judgment. Vivienne did not ask for it. She did not know Patricia intended to argue for it until Patricia called her to tell her the outcome. She was quiet for a moment when Patricia told her the amount. Then she said, "Thank you." She said, "I did not think anything was ever going to come of the DeKalb case." She said, "I let it go because I did not want to spend more time thinking about him than he was worth." Patricia said, "I am glad you answered when I called." Vivienne said, "I had been waiting for someone to call for 3 years." She said, "When you work that long for something and it does not come, you start to wonder whether you were right about what happened." She said, "The affidavit was for Morgan, but it was also for me. She was right that it happened." Getting to say so in a sworn legal document meant something. Tanya Wells and Morgan Hayes still speak. Not with the frequency or the texture of the pre-Cameron years. Those years are gone in the specific way that anything whose foundation is removed becomes something different. But they speak. Tanya calls on Morgan's birthday. Morgan calls on Tanya's. They have had coffee twice in the year following the judgment, in a restaurant in Decatur that Morgan chose. Not one of the restaurants from the rotation she and Cameron maintained for 9 years, but a different one, a newer one, a restaurant with no history attached to it that required revision. Tanya does not speak about Cameron in these meetings, and Morgan does not ask. What they have is something that is its own specific thing, separate from what it used to be, and not required to explain its own existence in relation to what it used to be. Tanya has said, in the one conversation they have had where the subject came up directly, "I do not understand all of what happened or all of why it happened. But I know what I saw in my living room on a Saturday morning in January." She said, "You handled yourself with more dignity than this situation deserved." Morgan said, "I had good examples." She meant Renee. She might have meant Tanya too. Tanya received it as though she did. This story is told, in the way that betrayal stories tend to be told, as a story about what Jordan Price did. He is the person who constructed the investment narrative, who received the funds, who purchased the property, in a name that was not Morgan's, who gave a deposition account that the court's findings implicitly contradicted. He is the person against whom the judgment was entered. He is the person who left Atlanta without announcement after the appeal was denied. He is the person Vivienne Cole is still monitoring in public records, and he deserves his place in this account. What he did was deliberate, sustained, and calculated. It produced $90,000 across multiple victims, a fraudulent marriage used as a legal vehicle for concealing the use of stolen funds, and a deposition performance that a Fulton County Superior Court found insufficient to overcome the documentary record. He is the architect. This is accurate. But the thing that stays with Morgan Hayes is not Jordan Price. She has said this directly. She has said, "Jordan Price was a stranger. He was someone I trusted because I was given reasons to trust him, and those reasons were constructed, and I understand that now, and I have processed it and moved forward," she said. Cameron Wells was not a stranger. Cameron Wells was 12 years. She was the person I called first. She was the person who said, "I trust your judgment," when I needed someone to confirm what I was thinking. And she said those words from a position of knowing things I did not know, and she chose to say them anyway, and that choice, the specific, active choice to be present in my life during the 18 months of the investment as my best friend, while she was simultaneously an investor in the same deal and a romantic partner of the man I was trusting, that is what I am still sitting with. Not because I have not processed it, but because it asks a question that I do not have a clean answer to. What do you do with 12 years that contains something like this in them? What do you do with the memories that are good memories and also memories of someone who was doing this at the same time? She said, "What I have decided is that the memories are what they were." Cameron and I had 12 years that were real in every dimension I experienced them in. The dinners were real. The phone calls were real. The things she said that helped me were real. The specific quality of being known by someone across a decade of your life, that was real. What was also real was what she was not telling me and what she was doing while she was not telling me. Both things were true at the same time, and I am not able to resolve them into a single clean narrative in which one cancels out the other. I am only able to hold them both and continue moving. She paused. She said, "I am moving. I am just doing it with a more accurate understanding of the space between what people show you and what they know. Aunt Diana told me to pay attention. I am paying attention. It is not the same as being protected, but it is the best available option, and I am choosing it. The question I want to leave you with is the one that this story makes unavoidable. If Cameron Wells had told Morgan Hayes, in February of 2022, the full truth, that she had met Jordan Price 4 months before the Stone Mountain dinner, that they had been in a relationship, that she had also invested in the East Point deal, would Morgan have proceeded with the investment? Maybe, maybe not, but she would have had the information. She would have been able to make a decision with the full picture, rather than with the picture that had been constructed for her. And the fundamental thing that this story documents is not the fraud, which is the legal category, and not the friendship betrayal, which is the personal category. The fundamental thing is the removal of information, the deliberate, sustained construction of a reality around a person that is incomplete in specific, useful ways. The telling of some truths and the withholding of others, in a proportion carefully calibrated to produce exactly the trust that the situation required. And the cost of that construction, $47,000 in 12 years, and the specific, irreversible expenditure of a period of Morgan's life that was not recovered by the judgment, because that is not what judgments recover. That cost belongs to the people who chose to build it. Tell me in the comments what you would have done. I read every one. What stayed with you from Morgan Hayes' story? Was it the 4 minutes it took to find the marriage certificate after she found the property record? Was it Cameron saying, "I trust your judgment," from a position of already knowing the things Morgan needed to know? Was it Aunt Diana in September of 2022 saying, "Pay attention," and Morgan telling her she was overthinking it? Was it the deposition and Jordan Price's attorney telling him to take his time and what he said when he had taken it? Or was it the text message, the 16 sentences that were not an apology? Tell me in the comments. Tell me what stayed. Tell me if you have been in a situation where you trusted someone for long enough that when the trust broke, the break required you to revise not just the present, but everything that had come before it. That specific experience, the retroactive revision, is the part of this kind of story that is never fully captured in the legal proceedings. Leave your comment. I read all of them. Before we go any further into this incredible story, do me a favor. If you love stories about justice, betrayal, revenge, and unexpected plot twists, hit that subscribe button right now. Seriously, you do not want to miss what comes next on this channel. Drop a like on this video. It helps more than you think. And comment below where you are watching from, so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Next week on Tales of Whisper, she found out her husband had been maintaining a second family in a city 2 hours away for 11 years. Not a girlfriend, a family, a wife, in every meaningful sense of that word, and 2 children. She found out not through his phone, not through a confrontation, but through a real estate document that arrived in the mail, addressed to him, and opened by her because she thought it was a bill. What she did in the 11 months that followed, not what she felt, not what she suffered, but what she specifically, methodically, deliberately did, produced an outcome that both families, in both cities, were entirely unprepared for. It is the most complete accounting of what happens when a woman with organizational skills and an extremely high threshold for patience decides that the time for patience is over. Subscribe to Tales of Whisper. New stories every single week, and they only go deeper from here.